within their company. If that's the driver, then it's reasonable. I'll share my income statement, balance sheet, cash flows. The reason being is that there's items within the income statement that are going to. Hi, everyone. I wanted to record a video on detailed forecasting. Now, it's important to note that this is beyond the scope of Acc531, but I still feel it's important in case you need to perform forecasting or budgeting, within your career. And so we'll cover the sequence and the how-to on income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow reporting or forecasting. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'll share my screen and we'll get to it. And so on detailed forecasting, the sequence is critically important. You need to forecast the income statement first, then the balance sheet, then the statement of cash flows. The reason being is that there's items within the income statement that are going to be key inputs into the balance sheet, and then key items within the income statement and balance sheet are going to be key inputs for forecasting the statement of cash flows. But first, let's focus on just the process. Number one is that you start out by obtaining the historical financial results on a GAAP basis from the 10K. And then we make our non-GAAP adjustments. And so removing those one-time unusual items so that our adjusted results have a clear view of the historical core business operating results. Now, after we've adjusted our financial statements, our historical financial statements, removing the one-time non-recurring items so that we just have a good look at our base results, now we're able to next analyze our trends. And so now, as we analyze our trends, those are going to be the starting point for our future forecast or our future budget. And then we will analyze those trends and factor in the company's strategy, their competitive position, macroeconomic forces, and we'll adjust up if we're feeling very confident that we're going to exceed historical trends, or adjust down if we feel more pessimistic. And then this next part, as far as developing and documenting our assumptions, this is probably what is most important in the forecasting process, because this is going to allow us to go back and post-audit or post-analyze what we got right, what we got wrong, so that we can continue to make improvements into the future. And then next, we're ready to actually calculate our forecast. Initially, we're going to start on the income statement forecast. Like we said, this is number one. This is what has to come first in the sequence. And within the income statement, where we're going to want to spend most of our time is developing a net sales forecast. This is critically important because this net sales forecast is going to be a key driver for many of the other line items within the income statement forecast, balance sheet forecast, as well as the statement of cash flows. And so when we talk about developing a net sales forecast, I would strongly encourage that you build this by segment. And segment is the segment disclosures that publicly traded companies are required to disclose to investors within the 10K. And so for an Energizer, our operating segments were North America, Latin America, EMEA, and Asia Pacific. It's really how the chief operating decision maker, usually the CEO, looks at and analyzes their business. And the reason why it's so important to build up your net sales forecast by segment is that each segment has different growth rates and different trends and different growth expectations. So again, at Energizer, we had our 4 operating segments, but the expectations for each segment were a lot different. And so a lot of our growth would come from Asia Pacific and Latin America. North America and EMEA was more of a stabilize or trying to hold those growth rates near prior year levels. But a lot of our growth would come from Latin America, and Asia Pacific. And so different historical trends, different future expectations. And so simply put, it's not a one size fits all. And so that's the reason we build it up by segment. And then after we analyze our trends, now we can factor in, well, what's the company saying? So for the next forecast, the next year's forecast, oftentimes in that year-end press release, the company is going to give investors guidance as to what they think next year's growth will be. And so for an investor, that would be a great input and an assumption source that we should consider. We could also look at, what's going on in the industry. And so what's the industry outlook? And then also factoring in the company's strategies and competitive positions. And so let's take a look at this. Is information for Church & Dwight. And so Church & Dwight has 4 operating segments. They have household products, they have personal care, they have consumer international, and then specialty products division, or SPD. And so again, building up by segment, there's going to be different growth rates and different expectations. First thing we do is we look at historical trends. And so the year 2020 was impacted by COVID. And so that makes analyzing trends a little bit more difficult. And so in practice, we may want to look at even farther out prior year information and trends to try to get a better feel, or definitely looking at industry data. And so looking at our historical trends, asking ourselves, will those trends continue based upon our assessment of the company's strategies, macroeconomic forces, competitive position, industry outlook? All of that has to be considered as we develop our assumptions. And so, documenting our assumptions is absolutely critically important for each of these years. And so after we go through all that work, we've documented our assumptions. Now we're able to develop our forecast estimates. And so what I have input for just example purposes is growth for their 4 segments. And I've highlighted those in yellow. And so for household products, we're assuming about a 5% growth rate across the 3-year forecast horizon. Similarly, a 5% growth rate for personal care. Now, based upon our understanding of the company's strategies, what management's saying, international is going to be a big source of growth for them. And so they have a higher growth rate, or we're plugging in as an example, a higher growth rate in consumer international. But based upon historical trends and also our understanding of management's priorities, SPD, they're just wanting to hold that business flat over the forecast horizon. And so by inputting these percentage growth rate changes, then allows us to calculate our dollars, our revenue forecast dollars over the 3-year forecast horizon. And so again, this is critically important. This is where you want to spend most of your time trying to get that net sales forecast right. And to repeat the steps, it's looking at historical trends, asking yourself, will those trends to continue, or should we adjust up or down based upon our understanding of the company's strategy, competitive position, industry outlook, macroeconomic factors, right? And then that allows us to document our assumptions, input our growth rates, and then to calculate our net sales forecast. And again, doing this by segment is really important because there's going to be different trends and different expectations by operating segment. And then now, after we have our net sales forecast completed, now we're able to and ready to move down the income statement. Next, we're going to focus on gross profit. And how we're going to forecast gross profit and also operating expenses isn't on a dollar basis, is that we're going to focus on percent of sales. The reason that we're going to focus on percent of sales is that as sales go up, well, cost of goods sold is going to go up as an example. Or when we get to the operating expenses, those that are variable in nature or vary based upon sales activity, are going to vary based upon your change in sales. And so by focusing on a percent of sales basis, it allows us to consider and contemplate that sales change, as well as looking at on a percent of sales basis, it allows us to also see that, hey, if we have increases in commodity cost, well, maybe there's an opportunity to offset those increases in commodity cost or inflation by pricing increases, right? And so at a percent of sales, it provides a more steady trend. It allows us to consider and contemplate sales changes, and also more succinctly analyzes our ability to offset inflationary cost impacts and just really hone in on, well, what's our gross margin percent of sales, right? And so forecasting this item on a percent of sales and then calculating the dollars and then plugging cost of goods sold is critically important. And then again, we're going to consider what the company is going to say, at least for the next fiscal year, and then factor in the company strategies and initiatives, peer benchmarks, industry outlooks, factoring in macroeconomic factors. All of that has to go into our assumptions. And so, we've already completed our net sales forecast, right? So the first thing we do is that we look at trends. And so the trend for Church & Dwight's gross margin as a percent of sales has been 44.4, an increase to 45.5, and then a slight step back to 45.2. Then that allows us to develop our assumptions and document those assumptions, and then ultimately develop our forecast. And we know that gross margin improvement is really important for Church & Dwight. It's a bonus metric of theirs, and also in their management presentations and earnings press release, they talk about this as a key focus area of management to continue to improve it. And so we believe that a 20 basis point improvement each year is realistic. And so again, we're forecasting on a percent of sales basis. Then that allows us to go in and calculate the dollars. We calculate the dollars by multiplying the percent of sales estimate multiplied by our net sales forecast that we've already completed. Then that allows us to calculate our dollars, and then we can back into cost of goods sold, or just plug cost of goods sold. And we do that for each of the 3 years over the forecast horizon. So again, forecast on a percent of sales, that allows us to better analyze trends, factor in changes in net sales, especially those variable components, and then also allows us to more succinctly analyze a company's ability to offset commodity or inflationary increases through pricing actions, mix changes, and things like that. And so forecasting that percent of sales then allows us to calculate gross profit dollars, like gross margin percent of sales times our already forecasted net sales. That's the reason we have to do net sales first. That allows us to calculate our gross profit dollars and then back into cost of goods sold, right? And so we'll do that over the 3-year forecast horizon. And so now we're ready to continue working our way down the income statement. And so we've done net sales, we've done gross margin percent of sales, that then allows us to calculate our gross profit dollars and back into or plug cost of goods sold. Next are operating expenses. Same thing with operating expenses. A lot of times these varies based upon sales activity, right? And so we're going to forecast and analyze our operating expenses on a percent of sales basis. Again, we're going to factor in company strategies, company guidance, and also any stated initiatives. This last point is critically important, is that we have to ensure that there's internal consistency. And so what I mean by that, if we're going to assume that net sales are going to increase, well, there has to be a driver or a reason for that net sales increase, right? It just doesn't happen automatically, right? And so what's going to enable or drive that net sales increase? Well, usually it's an investment in advertising. It's an investment in research and development, or it's an investment in our people, processes, or technology, right? So a lot of those are factored into operating expenses. And so you need to make sure that your forecast is internally consistent, meaning you're going to show an increase in sales. That has to be supported probably by an increased investment in advertising or research and development. Okay. So again, same process is we're going to analyze historical trends. And so for this company, we're going to look at SG&A as percent of sales and advertising percent of sales. It appears that research and development is included within SG&A. It's not separately broke out. We could find that breakout as we know within the footnotes. But we're going to forecast SG&A percent of sales and advertising and promotion as a percent of sales. And we know that based upon company guidance, their investor presentation, that they have a focused effort on improving their cost. And so we are able to forecast a 10 basis point improvement or reduction in advertising percentage, or I'm sorry, SG&A as percent of sales. But as a driver into that overall 5% net sales growth rate, well, that's going to be enabled by an increased investment in advertising. And so we're taking that savings from SG&A percent of sales and increasing our investment in advertising, showing a 10 basis point improvement over the 3-year forecast horizon. That's going to ensure that we're internally consistent, and that's going to be a driver of our net sales gains. So forecasting a percent of sales then allows us to calculate the dollars. And again, we calculate the dollars, we take that net sales forecast that we've already completed, multiplying it by our percent of sales, then that's what allows us to calculate our dollar forecast. So now we've completed net sales, gross profit, operating expenses, and thus income from operations. Now we have to finalize our work on the income statement. Now focusing on financing and other items. Now it's important to note that these do not, and I repeat, do not vary based upon sales activity. And so we're probably going to forecast these line items on a dollar basis. And so financing, the biggest component of financing is usually interest expense. And so we have to analyze debt levels on the balance sheet. My advice is that unless management has a stated policy to either reduce or increase debt for a specific reason, I would just assume that debt levels would be flat over the forecast horizon. That really allows us to just focus our forecast analysis on operating items, not financing decisions. And so now, again, if the company says that they have a stated initiative to reduce debt or to take out more debt, well, we need to factor that into our interest expense forecast. But if there's no mention of that, I would just assume that debt levels are going to be consistent with trend or flat to prior year levels. And if we're going to assume that debt's going to be flat to prior year levels, then it's reasonable to assume that interest expense is going to be flat to prior year levels. The same thing with other. Right? So there's a lot of things that go into your other income and expense. I would just assume that unless there's a stated item by management that it's going to change in the future, I would just keep it consistent with trend or prior year levels. Again, what that allows us to do is to analyze our forecast based upon the operating items, not financing and other decisions. And so with Church & Dwight, what we're doing is that we see that financing and other items, there's been a significant reduction. Well, as we analyze the MD&A, the 10K, investor call transcripts, is that over this period of time, there was a focused effort on reducing debt. But that effort's now complete. And so we're going to assume that debt levels are going to remain flat or consistent from 2020 to 2021, 2022, and 2023. And so by assuming debt's going to be flat, then we can assume that our dollars are going to be flat. And again, we are not forecasting this on percent of sales basis. We're forecasting this on a dollar basis. Next is our effective tax rate. And so we've done net sales, gross profit, operating expenses to give us income from operations. We've just completed financing and other. And so now we have our pre-tax income. But before we complete our income statement forecast, we have to forecast taxes, tax expense, and then net income, and eventually earnings per share. And so as it relates to effective tax rate, this is complicated. Usually the company provides guidance. If the company doesn't provide guidance, then you can analyze historical trends to see if there's a reasonable trend and a reasonable rate that we can use for a forecast horizon. If not, if the company does not provide guidance, if there's not a reasonable trend, then what I would do is that I would just insert 21 to 23%. 21% is the federal corporate rate, and then an extra 2% also includes the state rate. And so for Church and Dwight, they have a rate of about 19.1, 18.8, 18.5, so around 18.5 to 19%. That's reasonable because of not only their domestic or US operations, but also their international operations. And so that 18.5, we're just going to keep that consistent over the forecast horizon. Hopefully the company has provided guidance, but even not, is that their trends are reasonable. And so we'll just keep that flat or equal to the most recent fiscal year. And so by forecasting the effective tax rate, then that in turn allows us to calculate our tax expense dollars. So the effective tax rate times that pre-tax income allows us to calculate our tax expense dollars. Then in turn, that allows us to calculate our net income, pre-tax income minus tax expense. Now, ultimately, we're going to want to forecast earnings per share. And so net income divided by shares outstanding. And again, the approach that we're going to use here is that we're going to analyze trends. And if there's not an observable trend, we can just set the shares or shares outstanding equal to prior year levels. Again, this allows us to really focus our forecast on operating results, not financing decisions, not capital allocation decisions such as share buybacks and things like that, right? And so for Church and Dwight, we see that there's a trend of increasing shares outstanding by about 0.2 or 0.3%. This is likely due to executive compensation as they're issuing their executives shares within their company. Well, if that's the driver, then it's reasonable to assume that they're going to continue offering that type of compensation and increasing their external share count. And so we're going to continue to increase shares outstanding by 0.2%. Then that in turn allows us to calculate our shares outstanding over the forecast horizon. And so after we're done, I think it's important to take a step back and review all of our forecast assumptions and assess whether or not we feel good that our forecast is based upon solid assumptions. And so if we review, our revenue growth of 5%, we look at trends, we look at the company strategy, industry outlook, peer performance, right? So if we feel good about that, we move on. Gross margin. In our forecast, we have that increasing 20 basis points per year. Well, that makes sense for Church and Dwight. It's a focus item of theirs. It's an incentive compensation metric. They have a history of increasing gross margin percent of sales. So we feel good about that forecast assumption. The company has a stated policy of trying to be more efficient or reduce their cost. And so we show an improvement or a reduction in SG&A percent of sales. They're going to redirect that savings and increase their investment in advertising. And that's critically important because that's going to be an enabler of our revenue growth. Then we're going to assume that debt levels are going to remain consistent or flat versus prior year levels, and thus our financing and other or interest expense is going to be equal to prior year. And so as we flow all that through, it allows us to calculate our earnings per share over the forecast horizon. And we look at, well, what's that mean for our earnings per share growth? Well, over the last 2 years, it's grown about 9.5 and 14%. Now, based upon our forecast assumptions that we just covered, we have it growing by 6.3, 6.2, and 6.2%. And then we have to ask ourselves, does that match our board expectations? Does that match our shareholder expectations? If yes, then let's lock down our forecast or our budget. If no, don't go back and just arbitrarily or without basis increase sales or increase or gross margin percent of sales or decrease costs. There has to be a solid reason and a solid assumption. If you still feel good about your forecast assumptions, there's no room left in that, then you need to consider alternative levers. Well, maybe it's time to do mergers and acquisitions. Maybe you can reduce your share count if your goal is to improve earnings per share and by doing share repurchase or embarking upon a cost reduction activity. And so the point here is that don't just simply plug an item in the forecast to hit a bottom line result. Your forecast and your budget has to be based upon solid assumptions. If you feel really good about your assumptions, then you may need to look at alternative levers if you want to find ways to increase your earnings per share forecast, right? And so that's all there is for income statement forecasting. I'll record a separate video for balance sheet and also cash flow forecasting.